Welcome to the OK Book Club, where we dive into stories, books, people, and tons of different topics. And today we're going to explore fairy tales. Yes, as we go forward, we'll be talking about lots of different genres of books and stories. And today's episode is about the stories that we all grew up on, our first introductions to what stories could do to captivate us. And they have a rich, really interesting history. And in this episode, we'll talk about that history. We'll talk about the most popular fairy tales. And we'll set the scene for being able to dive into specific fairy tales as we go forward. It all started back in France in 1697. And interestingly enough, there were two writers, one Charles Perrault and another lady by the name of Madame Dunois. And they actually released in the same year two different books. Madame Dunois' book was called Tales of Fairies. Charles Perrault's book was basically, the title was Stories of Past Times, with a subtitle called Tales of Mother Goose. Now, both of these writers were popular at the time. They were contemporaries, and I'll be diving into separate episodes on both of these people because they basically invented this genre. The genre, like most stories, began verbally through the ages. And what they did is they basically put all these together, developed them, and wrote a lot of these initial stories with their kind of own take. But they were not for children. Boys and girls and parents, that's important for you to know. And I'm not going to get into any details about what they were all about, but if you do some research, it is interesting. Over time, they were adapted for children. Why? Because they had messages, life lessons, just like the Aesop's fables of, hundreds and thousands of years ago. These were more contemporary, but they were able to be brought down to the children's level to let them know about, what it is to live a good life and what really you shouldn't do. But initially, they were told to aristocrats, which boys and girls are basically people that are related to the kings and queens of the time. So after this time, later on, we got basically another 100 years later, you have the Brothers Grimm that come along. And they were from Germany. And in 1812, they published a book called Children's Household Tales. And some of the many fairy tales that we know today, Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, they all came from the Brothers Grimm. And again, they didn't write these particular tales. They gathered them up from historical tales that were passed down verbally, and they put them into this book. So this genre became even more and more popular. And then shortly after that, in 1835, another author comes along, Hans Christian Andersen, who really cemented this fairy tale genre with these stories put together in his collection of books, Little Mermaid, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Ugly Duckling. So it's a rich history of fairy tales that still exist today. And I would argue in my previous podcast that the modern fairy tale writings, like the Hotel Balzar, like the Puppets of Spellhorse. So today, lots of people are writing their modern versions of these stories. As I referenced with K.T. Camille's two books, those two books are basically a trilogy. the Tales of Normandy. And even more recently, Chris Colfer, very popular series, The Land of Stories. So these fairy tales are constantly evolving, but clearly they are so popular, especially because of Walt Disney and what he did starting in the 1940s with the famous film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And it continues today. The adaptations of these stories, boys and girls, as a famous song from Beauty and the Beast. It's a tale as old as time. And in my opinion, they will always continue to be popular through generations. Why? Because as children, adults today, right? I have wonderful, great feelings about having my parents read these stories out loud to me, having early teachers in my early formative years having these stories told to me, and such great feelings. And then you become a parent and it starts all over again. And what Walt Disney did to not only bring it to the next level, but the songs, the movies just become so emotional and so memorable. And again, just to quickly go back, and this will be the focus of a future episode, ultimately, as these stories became translated into English, this subcategory, this subgenre of Mother Goose tales that were originally introduced from Charles Perrault, these tales go back plenty of years in the past. Mother Goose, as referenced in terms of stories, go back prior to Charles Perrault, but he just brought it into the public sphere and became so popular. But as they were translated into English, they became nursery rhymes, smaller stories, where really the first introduction to most stories for most children were in these Mother Goose nursery rhymes for young children. And really, they became distinct and different from the fairy tale full stories that we're familiar with. So let's talk about what goes into fairy tales, what makes them unique and different from other genres. Well, you have, as part of fairy tales, and this doesn't apply to everyone, but generally speaking, you will see good versus evil. You will see the protagonist against the antagonist, right? You will see the beginning, once upon a time, as you know, and you will see the ending very often as they all lived happily ever after. There will be, certainly, as I mentioned many times, morals, lessons learned. The setting, very often they were in kingdoms of kings and queens. Very often they would be during medieval times. So boys and girls, we're talking about the years of 500 right through almost to 1500. So almost 1,000 years. And obviously, why is that? Well, when they originally became popular, they were written, like I said, early on in the late 1600s. That was just them being put into books and put down on pencil and paper, right? And published in books. But these were told for centuries. And obviously, during that time, they were medieval times. Knights, princesses, princes, kings, queens. Another element is magic. Some type of magic that, again, comes from this tradition of making the stories really come alive. You'll see that with talking animals. You'll see that with fairy godmothers. All magic type of settings, ultimately, that will drive the plot. And again, going back to why they're so special, I mean, in my own memories, I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, and my mother read these stories to me at an early age. I do remember early teachers reading them to me. And then particularly, this is how old I am, they weren't cassette tapes. They weren't CDs, right? I used to listen to records on a record player. And the Disney versions of Jack and the Beanstalk with Mickey Mouse and that big giant. You got Snow White that I used to listen to on records. And I would just get up on top of my bunk bed, lay down, and for some reason, I guess I remember them being, sick, having the day off from school, and just sitting there on the top of my bunk bed and listening to these great versions. Yes, Disney versions. And just to dive into this again very briefly, when Walt Disney issued the movie, the first cartoon movie, Boys and Girls, it was very controversial. A lot of monies. They just said no way that anybody would go to a movie in a movie theater and watch a cartoon. It was so well done, and it set the scene for everything in his future with this company that is so huge and all the theme parks. And most children, my generation and currently this generation, growing up, knowing fairy tales because of Walt Disney. Originally, it was Snow White. It was Sleeping Beauty. There were so many movies made. And then right through the 50s and the 60s, there was a lull. And Disney wasn't really putting out very popular movies. And they returned to the genre with a lot of success. When now I was adults and we had our own children. And what were those movies that rekindled the excitement of this genre? It was the early 90s, like I said, and it was The Little Mermaid in succession. Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and then it went on to other folk tales and old stories like Aladdin. But these versions of the stories are what most children today growing up know because of Walt Disney. So with this, to wrap up our episode, let's rank the top 20 fairy tales of all time. And yes, this is one man's opinion, mine. Pause this video now and think, just let's say the top 5, top 10. What is in your wheelhouse as the most popular fairy tales of all time? And no doubt, Walt Disney has a lot to do with this, absolutely positively. But starting at number 20, The Fisherman and His Wife. Number 19, Thumbelina. Number 18, The Frog Prince. Number 17, The Princess and the Pea. 16, Hansel and Gretel. 15, Rumpelstiltskin. 14, The Snow Queen, that was eventually made into Frozen, the Disney movie Frozen. 13, Rapunzel, which again eventually was made into the movie Tangled by Walt Disney. Number 12, The Three Little Pigs. Number 11, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And now the top 10. And before I dive into this list, right, you don't need to know all of these, but you need to know of these. And you want to, especially if you're new parents, and me being a new grandfather, you want to get to know these, read these, breathe them to your children, your grandchildren, to keep the classics going into future generations. So, number 10, The Ugly Duckling. Number 9, Puss in Boots. Number 8, The Emperor's New Clothes. Number 7, Jack and the Beanstalk. Number 6, The Little Red Riding Hood. 5, Sleeping Beauty. 4, The Little Mermaid. And the top 3, I think if anybody says immediately fairy tales, these will be the ones I gotta believe that will be in the top most popular. Off the top of your head, you say fairy tales, these are the 3. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, number 3. Number 2, Beauty and the Beast. And number 1, Cinderella. And a few points about Cinderella. I would encourage you, number 1, to see both versions, Disney versions, the cartoon that came out a long time ago. Lots of fun. And certainly the live animated film. Really brilliantly done. I mean, it's just it's a home run. It's drop the mic. It's fairy tales. You got to think of Cinderella. So, like I said, we will have future podcast episodes on some of these fairy tales. I thank you for staying with us on this latest version of the OK Book Club podcast. And keep learning.